We do a very brief introduction for all of our guests. I'm sure most of you know that Faye is a professor emeritus of humanities at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. She got her PhD in comparative literature from Brown University. She's well published, and what else? And I think all of you know that she sings with the klezmer band, and she plays keyboard and sings as well. So, oh, and this is something I didn't know, that you were an undefeated champion on Jeopardy. So thank you very much. And I guess everyone has muted, and I'm going to put you on the speaker view so that we can, let's see, if everyone will please mute. And I'll stop there we go.
Okay,
so thank you.
So the timing could be better. I mean, it does seem a strange time for me to talk about the long ago traditions of the Jewish comic supernatural with what's going on in Israel. But on the other hand, we have also a long tradition of laughter through tears, of coping with the terrible happenings to the Jewish people through laughter. So I'm hoping that people will appreciate this break from the tension. So what is the Jewish comic supernatural? I'm sorry to disappoint anyone who came to hear about the Jewish connection with the American comic book. It's a fine topic, but not what I'm going to talk about. If you saw today's Bethel weekly announcements, the correct title and description are there and nowhere else. So the best way to define is by example. And the best example of the Jewish comic supernatural is one I'll bet you're all familiar with, Tevye's dream in Fiddler on the Roof. The scene comes directly from Sholem Aleichem's original tales of Tevye the Dairyman. To remind you, to convince Golda to let their daughter Tzeitel marry Muttel the tailor instead of Laser Wolf the butcher, Tevye invents a dream full of omens, good and mainly bad. The benevolent spirit of Grandma Tzeitel comes from Jener Welt with blessings on her namesake if she marries the tailor. But then the dreadful, demonic spirit of the butcher's first wife, Fruma Sarah, appears and curses anyone who marries her husband. And it's all hilarious, although Golda is frightened when Tevye recounts it. In the original tale by Sholem Aleichem, translated from the Yiddish, Tevye says, "Why make a short story long? I must be made of iron if I could manage to lie there under the blankets without bursting from laughter when I told my dream." So please hang on to questions, because I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. Note them down if you think of them as I go along. You can even put them in the chat which I'm not going to look at until I'm finished. Okay? So, Jewish, comic, supernatural, a lighthearted approach to seriously held beliefs, and a send-up of those beliefs for the more skeptical people. Today, Jewish and humor go together like French and cuisine, but it has not always been so. At Beth Jacob, Rav Julius's Torah study for Parsha Bechar Bechukotai, which was last Shabbat, showed that the Talmud had a very distrusting attitude towards satirical or practical joking. The rabbis interpreted the prohibition in that Parsha on exploiting your brother to include making jokes about him or giving him misinformation, even with the excuse of, "I was only joking." Lots of remarks or pranks are funny unless you are the butt of the joke. It reminds us of Mel Brooks's famous saying, "Comedy is when you trip on a banana peel, fall in the gutter, and break your leg. Tragedy is when I have a headache." The rabbis of the Talmud and later distrusted professional comedians or fools. Jews because of the Talmud, we know that Jews were acting in comedies in the Roman arena, similar to today's rodeo clowns. In the Middle Ages, Jews served as court jesters, like Danny Kaye in the classic movie. Who knew it was historically accurate? Both are condemned in the rabbinic tradition. Comedy can be subversive. Even though the court jester, or as Shakespeare called him, the all-licensed fool, was supposed to be able to say anything he wanted, in the real world, rulers did not like to be opposed or made an object of laughter. There are records of jesters, both Jewish and Gentile, being punished or executed for making the wrong joke at the wrong time. Now, about 4 years ago, I was invited to speak at UCLA at an international academic symposium on the comic supernatural. And they asked me mainly to speak about the Jewish tradition leading through the Middle Ages, which is what I did. But I said that for the Yiddish tradition, basically the Middle Ages continued into the 19th century. And some would say in the Orthodox community, it continues still. Many of the stories, the folklore that I'm going to be referring to were collected in Israel in the 20th century. And some go back as far as the Talmud. So I'll be jumping around through a very large period of time. I'll look at the folklore collected in rabbinic times in what's called the Agadah portion of the Talmud, at stories of Hasidic wonder-working rabbis, and those from Israel's folklore archives for examples of a comic approach to the supernatural. I will tell you about my Uncle Izzy, may he rest in peace, who, when I told him that I was going to study folklore in college, asked me why I had to go to college to study Bubba Mices. If you don't know the term Bubba Misa, it's usually translated as old wives' tale or grandmother's tale, Bubba Misa. But actually it goes back to the Middle Ages in Yiddish, when one of the first printed books in Yiddish was called the Bubba Book. And it was it's usually translated B-O-B-O, the Bubba Book. And it was a collection of, well, supernatural tales, comic supernatural tales. So here we are. We could say that it's a very old tradition. Tonight, I'm going to talk about golems, demons, and maybe even the famous fools of Chelm, depending on the time. But first, a few examples from the Tanakh. So, you can give me a thumbs up or a hands up if you know the story of Elijah's duel with the priests of Baal. Elijah's duel with the priests of Baal. It's in 1 Kings chapter 18, and it's one of the Haftorot. I can't remember which week. So I laugh at it every time. Basically, the priests of Baal who have taken over in the under the King Ahab, are challenged to a duel by the prophet Elijah, as to which God is greater. Pretty much, each of them they take a young bullock. And Elijah says, you will invoke your God by name, and I will invoke Yud-He-Vav-He, my God by name, and let us agree. The God that responds with fire, that one is God. They took the bullock. I'm reading the translation of the Bible now. They took the bullock that was given them, they prepared it, and invoked Baal by name from morning until noon, shouting, "Oh, Baal, answer us!" But there was no sound and none who responded. So they performed a hopping dance around the altar. At this point, did Elijah curse the prophets of Baal? Did he proclaim, My God is an awesome God, and wave his staff at the altar and shoot out flames. Wrong, not this prophet. When noon came, Elijah mocked the priests of Baal, saying, "Shout louder! After all, he is a god, but he may be in conversation, he may be detained, or he may be on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and will wake up." I was just reading from the Bible. Elijah does shtick. Who knew? Can you just imagine this in Mel Brooks's voice? Wake up, Baal. All right. So another example, perhaps
we're all muted, so you can't hear the laughter. Don't worry.
Right. Okay. So perhaps the most famous example from the Tanakh is the story of Balaam and the ass. Speaking of fools, Balaam was reputed to be the greatest wizard in the world. He's hired by the king of Moab to curse the Israelites. God speaks directly to Balaam. Forget about it. Balaam still proceeds on his way, and he fails to notice an angel with a drawn sword. But his ass, that is, the donkey he's riding on, sees the angel the wizard missed. The exchange of dialogue between ass and rider has led modern Bible commentators to call this Numbers chapter 22 the only deliberately comic passage in the Torah, which it might be. Talking animals can often be found in folk tales, but they are rare in the Bible, after a certain snake, that is. Balaam had a wise ass, and the story was a great reminder that the wise can be the greatest fools of all. So, what about those stories about demons that I mentioned? Now, I'll tell you a true demon story. That is, a true story about demons. I mentioned that I was going to be speaking at UCLA, and this is when Beth Jacob was still having all its Shabbat services in person. And I mentioned that I would be out at UCLA, and then among other things, I was going to tell stories about Bubba about demons and so on. And someone, a regular member of the congregation who's not on this call tonight, said, "That's ridiculous. No Jew still believes in demons today." And I said, "Ever heard anyone say Kanahara?" And he said, "Of course." I said, "Well, apparently some Jews still believe in the powers of demons, because Kanahara is said to avert the evil eye and to keep those demons away." And I said, "Ever hear of anybody still putting a red thread on a baby's wrist?" Yeah, same thing. So anyway, demons. Where are we? The Jewish beliefs in demonic powers often came from the people around them. It's not a coincidence that many people around the Mediterranean have the same belief in the power of the evil eye and the same kind of averting of evil that we do when we say Kanahara. And you'd think that, if people are so afraid of them, how could you have funny stories about them? And yet, there are. There are stories about demons who are tricky, like poltergeists, and enjoy mocking people. And they're called jesters, letzim or letzonim. They are shapeshifters, and the stories about them are definitely told for laughs. Part of a type of tale called wagoner's tales, told by travelers as entertainment at inns. So one was collected in Romania in the 19th century called Mocking Devils, about a wagoner driving too late at night on a deserted road who sees what looks like a prize buck lying in the road. He tries to lift it onto his wagon, finders keepers, but it's too heavy for him. The wagoner jumps back to the seat and tries to spur on the horses, but it's as though they were tied with ropes. He looks behind him, and there, sitting on the wagon, was the buck, smoking a pipe. The wagoner remembers to pray a bit late, and the apparition disappears, having achieved its goal of mocking this human being. In another variant, the apparent roadkill is a huge sheep, and instead of smoking a pipe, it discovers itself clapping its hooves and laughing. So there are other stories that are similar about these mocking demons. All obviously meant to evoke laughter, since the victim of the jester demon gets away with nothing more than a good scare. Another supernatural creature related to these Letzonim is the Lantuch, or Yiddish hobgoblin. If you read Isaac Bashevis Singer's wonderful collection of stories for children, sorry, I'm having trouble with my light. I think the computer doesn't like these stories. There we go. In his stories for children, if you read these wonderful stories, he's got one about this Yiddish hobgoblin who reminds us of the English brownie, maybe. As Singer's Aunt Yentl tells us, yes, there is such a spirit as the Lantush. These days, people don't believe in such things, but in my time, they knew that everything can't be explained away with reason. A Lantuch is an imp, but he's not malicious. He tries to help the members of the household all he can. In one story, this Lantush so loves the daughter of the house that he frightens her into being unable to speak. But he makes an almond cake and leaves it on her bed, and she's all better. So, the best known apparition in Jewish folklore, supernatural being, is probably the golem. How many people have heard of the golem? Hands up. Right, of course, of course. And in most, the golem stories that we tend to read today come out of the 19th and early 20th century, and they're more tragic than comic. The famous story about the golem of Prague, who acts as a protector to the ghetto. Well, that story, even though it's set in the 17th century, actually comes much earlier. It's set in the 17th century, rather, it came much later, and was a late 19th century response to anti-Semitism and the blood libel. The earliest golem stories, however, are closer to the Yiddish word goylem. And a goylem in Yiddish is really a word used to describe a clumsy, dumb person who can't get out of his own way and just messes everything up. And the legends of the golem, I should say, really were more like that. They were about artificial beings who, well, did stupid things. What can you say? The pattern of all of these tales, the golem is ordered to draw water, and he won't stop. He floods the whole town. He's ordered to bake matzah, and he uses up all of the wheat in the whole country, makes it, and he just won't stop baking. Okay. Do these stories sound familiar to you? Well, many of you might remember Mickey Mouse in Fantasia in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where he is asked to draw water, and he animates a broom and tells the broom to draw water, and there's just millions of brooms drawing millions of buckets of water. That story, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, is based on those medieval comic golem legends. Okay. Let's see. So in all of the golem stories, though, only its creator can animate the golem, and only the creator can stop the golem, usually by removing the name of God, the Shem, either from its mouth or from its forehead. And that returns the golem to clay. Right. But originally, not originally, but the idea of the golem is from the Kabbalah. It's sort of, you know, how to pass the ultimate exam. If you can animate life from clay, you are like God, because Adam was described as a golem, a being made out of clay and animated by the breath of God. There's a story, from the Talmud, from Sanhedrin. Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Oshaya spent every Sabbath Eve in studying the book of creation. They created a calf, 1/3 natural size, and ate it. And this was subject to much later debate. And this proof text has been cited recently in determining whether lab-grown meat can possibly be considered kosher. Most of the scholars on this don't think of the golem calf story as satiric, but I do. I can totally see it as a satirical story deflating these rabbis, making fun of these rabbis for attempting to mock God and creating only a calf that they ate. But who knows? Okay, I've got a few minutes for the fools of Chelm. Now, you might wonder, what's supernatural about fools? Well, actually, the fools of Chelm stories are fantastic in that even as they were told, they were exaggerated to such a point that this city that was all fools, was, of course, like nothing on earth, except that, of course, Chelm was a real place. That I don't know how they liked being made fun of that way, but it was. So there's lots of wonderful stories about the classic fools. For example, there's the bride-to-be in Chelm who doesn't want to marry the groom that's been chosen for her. She says, I don't want to marry a stranger. You got to marry Papa, so why shouldn't I? Oh, well, the logic. There's the story about stealing the moon, that they take literally the idea that there's a new moon every month. And so they try to steal the old one since nobody's going to need it because there's going to be a new moon come Rosh Chodesh. Are fools really fantastic? Well, these days, these stories of Chelm are really haunted for us. There's only in the afterlife is there a happy ending for the fools of Chelm. For us, we know that, that there's no one left from that city. All right. So, do these beliefs survive in new forms, in stories, in practices so old we've forgotten why we do them, like saying Kanahara or throwing salt over the shoulder if you've spilled it? All we can say is it's a tradition. And Jewish humor, of course, survives in many forms and continues to this day, when, as I started, we're likely to think of it as a coping mechanism for a world gone crazy, for laughter through tears, a way of making light of what is serious, even God, even supernatural beings, even the prophets, as we have seen. So I've seen a couple of questions in chat, or a couple of comments. And Sherry, you still have a hand up, though I don't see a question. Right. Jerome starts with, I'll read it. Jerry, you can unmute yourself while I read yours, and if you want to comment more. Jerry says, I'm the product of one half Litvak and one half Galicianer. My father, the Glitz, loved humor and joking, whereas my mother and her family tended to be much more proper. Joking and belly laughter were not part of their personalities. Does anyone have a similar family experience? Well, I'll start and say that my parents really were neither, but that traditionally, at least, Litvaks, Lithuania, was the rationalist part of Judaism, was the non-Hasidic, sort of non-mystical strain of Judaism. So it seems to carry through with the humor as well. Anybody else have a similar experience? Or Jerry, do you want to comment further? Jerry, you're muted. Jerry, unmute. Still muted. Kathleen, are you allowing people to unmute? You might have to.
How about now? How about now? Okay.
Now you're fine.
Oh, yeah, I was stuck. Yeah, well, you know, in my parents' own way, they would disparage each other's tribal customs. My mother, in her own inimitable way, would say what the worst Litvak has in one finger, the best Galicianer doesn't have in their whole body. So, you know, there was this mutual disparaging, half humor, half in jest. And my father, with a belly laugh, would come through, ho, ho, ho. And yet my very proper relatives on my mother's side were, oh, don't laugh like that. I don't know. So I guess I inherited my father more. Mm-hmm. His tendencies somewhat more.
Anybody else?
The degree to which they took that with a degree of seriousness surprised me, because, you know, we're all the same, and yet, well, the tradition went on. But in that regard, I would like to mention that my mother, although born in the United States, was very much old world, and she brought with her superstitions. And I grew up with superstitions that nobody else seems to know about, or I've asked wherever possible, I will ask again if anyone has any such experience in their background. When, as a 7-year-old, I would lose a tooth, the normal thing in America, you put it under a pillow and you get a quarter or some reward. As far as we were concerned, my siblings and myself, that was extremely goyish. Don't even think about such a thing. So what was the proper thing to do with that tooth? Hold it in your hand and make a 3-time incantation, whirling it around your head in Yiddish. Meisele, meisele, nadera benenum, gib mir anayanum. And then throw it in the oven. And God forbid we did anything but. So my mother took it very seriously. So I have searched the world, asking people, looking in the literature, and I wonder, was it an extremely localism that led my mother to be so involved in the seriousness of the Bauermeister? And the question is, has anyone ever heard of anything remotely like that?
No.
Mice and little and teeth and ovens.
Yep. Sima? Sima, is that?
Yeah, Jerry, would you translate would you translate what you were saying when you were whirling the tooth over your head?
Little mouse, here is a bone. Give me a new one.
Wow.
Oh, that's adorable.
Wow. Well, nobody else has a similar family experience. I'm going to go to Nadine Lipman's question, and it's okay if you unmute yourself, Nadine. She notes that we visited Prague and the synagogue where the golem inhabits the attic, as well as the grave of Rabbi Lowe, who is credited with creating the golem. Yes, I deliberately, kind of scanted that because that is definitely not a comic story. There were a lot of legends about wonder-working rabbis with mute, huge servants, and they were spread throughout the old world. And many were attached to the definitely real Rabbi Yehuda Loew ben Betzalel of Prague, who lived from about 1525 to 1609. Not in his time. In his own time, he was known for being a mystic and an expert scholar of the Kabbalah. And also, he was an alchemist. And he was a friend of the Emperor Rudolf, who was also an alchemist, who worked at the Habsburg court. It was really only later that people put these things together and said, well, he must have made a golem if he did all of these other things. And that's why when you're in Prague, there is a wonderful statue of Rabbi Loew and his golem. But it's a 19th century statue. It's not a 17th century or 16th century statue. And then the legend grew up that, of course, if he had a golem and he was the rabbi of the Altneu Shul, then where's the golem? Well, obviously in the attic. So yes, when you go there, you will be solemnly told that you can't go up in the attic because the golem is sleeping. Yes. I was lucky enough to twice be invited to be a scholar in residence in Prague at Charles University, which is practically overlooking that Altneu Shul. And I joked about, there's a saying, carrying coals to Newcastle in England, which was a coal shipping port. Well, I was definitely carrying coals to Newcastle because I was in Prague, the most Gothic city on the face of the earth. And what did they want me to talk about? American Gothic. So I was talking about Poe and Lovecraft and Hawthorne and lots of other American authors in Prague. Other questions?
Yeah.
Comments?
I have another question.
Sure, Jerry.
Where does the Dybbuk fit into this?
Okay. There aren't too many funny Dybbuk stories at all, although I did find one. Let's see if I can find it for you. Okay. The Dybbuk is what we might call misunderstood Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, there is this belief that what we might call reincarnation, or the transmigration of souls. That is possible for a soul to have a new life in a new body. There also was a belief that these spirits could not only be reincarnated, but they might still be sort of trapped on this plane and could actually possess a human being. It's just barely conceivable that this could be played for laughs, but mostly possession by the spirit of a dead person is a tragic story. And the most tragic of stories is the Yiddish play, The Dybbuk, or Between Two Worlds, whose author's pseudonym was Ansky, who collected this, went to an actual exorcism while collecting folklore in the Russian Pale of Settlement. Let's see.
I think Sherry had her hand up.
Yeah, I'm just kind of finishing up the Dybbuk story. I found one Dybbuk story from the 16th century legends of Rabbi Isaac Luria. A Dybbuk enters a fish, and when the fish is caught, the Dybbuk possesses the body of the woman who eats it, Rabbi Luria pronounces the holy name, and out pops the Dybbuk, like a spiritual Heimlich maneuver removing a fishbone from her throat. But that's the only funny Dybbuk story I found. Sherry?
I was going to say I too grew up in a very superstitious household, very Eastern European. You know, all four grandparents very Eastern European, and definitely there was a red ribbon on the crib. You didn't discuss the name of the baby until later. You didn't, you know, there were a lot about the angel of death that, you know, my Bubby was sick, they changed her name. My dad was named after an uncle, but because he died young, they called him by his middle name his whole life. My mom didn't even know that that was his first name until they got married. David was his first name.
Wow.
And things like when I was pregnant, don't look at somebody who's ugly, a lot of that stuff. But now would the angel of death be considered one of those?
Yes,
natural?
yes. Well, exactly. That in there too. That's I did not collect any comic stories about the Malachamavas. No, this is there's some things that you did not play for laughs, exactly as you said.
And a lot of oy all the time. Everything was oy vey. I mean, that's common. Like, you know, there was the toot and then the toot. You know, no Ken Horrors, toot, all the time.
Well, that was the spitting, which also was found in the Italian tradition. It seems to be a Mediterranean thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the stories. Other people?
Yes, I I have an actual family story that is relevant. Okay. Part of my mother's family, I think a distant cousin, was pregnant. And while pregnant, she was in Brooklyn, sitting on the stoop. A beggar came along and asked for money. And she said no. And the beggar thrust a hand in front of her that was deformed. Well, she had a child, a lady, and the child's hand was deformed. And the family was absolutely convinced of a causative effect. Well, quite a coincidence, but you could not convince them other than an absolute causative relationship.
Wow. Irene?
Oh, hello. A couple of things you said that triggered some.
Oh, can I ask people to, everybody else to mute? There seems to be something going on here with echoes. Yeah.
Yeah, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So a couple of things you said just triggered some thoughts. One was right at the beginning, something that you said triggered the thought about all the Jewish political satirists and comedians. And the one that I just saw today was the Borowitz report. I don't know if he's Jewish or not, but the Borowitz name sounds Jewish to me. And there's tons of them, you know, out there. And then I wondered if you'd comment on the influence of Judaism on Freud's theories about humor.
Oh, that's so true. There's no doubt that his Jewish background did. I call, in fact, I would call him the greatest Jewish writer about humor. In fact, Freud was criticized because so many of his examples came from the Jewish background. He was, call him the famous Jewish commentator on jokes and the unconscious. That the juxtaposition of the comic with the supernatural is very Freudian. The scarier something is, the more we need to deal with it through laughter. The world is a scary place, and we deflect the scariness by making light of it. So yeah, there's no doubt that his book on jokes and the unconscious is very much affected by this kind of thinking. And as far as, you know, the prevalence of Jews as comic satirists, there's some huge percentage of all famous comedians in the 20th and 21st century are Jewish. With if there were no Jews, there might be no comedy. Yes, Bruce.
Yes, I was just wondering, do you have any stories about keeping the old moon?
Oh, I just gave the very shortened version of it. The Fools of Chelm, they set out to capture the moon in a bucket. And they're going to, they want a moon because after all, there are a lot of nights when it's dark and there's no full moon. So they set out, they find a big bucket of water, a huge tub of water, and they position it so that they've got the reflection of the moon. And then they tell everyone that they've captured the moon. The rabbi says, you know, are you sure you should do this? And they say to the rabbi, but you know, every month we pray for the new moon, and we go out and we say the kiddush, the blessing of the levana of the new moon. But this means that now we will have this moon for all those nights when it is dark. And of course, much to their surprise, the next morning, their moon is gone.
I think Dan had his hand up.
Yeah. Okay, Dan.
Thank you, Bruce. A short question, then a slightly longer one. So, was there ever a real place called Chelm?
Yeah, there was. She mentioned that earlier.
You mentioned that earlier. Okay,
yeah.
I missed that.
Yeah.
And what does American Gothic mean? And why were the authors that you mentioned, why were they representative of American Gothic?
Whoa, that's a big one. Okay, Gothic literature is usually thought to have originated in the late 18th century with an attempt by British novelists to revive what they saw as the horror and fantasy of the Middle Ages. They started, and then it came to encompass any fiction that was full of horror and the supernatural and castles and the Inquisition and evil villains menacing innocent women. Eventually it came to be applied to things that had nothing to do with the Middle Ages. It just sort of, the term Gothic referred to this particular strain of horror, of family secrets, of inheritances, and as I said, women forced into marriage against their will and captured by evil villains and rescued by heroes. You find the Gothic in melodrama, you find it in the earliest movies, and so perhaps the most famous classics of the Gothic might be Frankenstein and Dracula. Well, the American Gothic is a whole sort of separate development from this English Gothic that I just so quickly described. And starting from really the 17th century in America, the Puritans imposed a Gothic worldview on New England, where they believed that the devil was constantly menacing them and the devil could work through witches. So we have the Salem witch trials, or through the Native Americans. And so we have the extermination of the native peoples. The writers who invented the American Gothic were more likely to draw on this 17th century inheritance of the Puritans and the horrors. The horrors of slavery are a great topic of the American Gothic, but then there were writers in America who set their works in other parts of the world, in Europe. So you have Poe, on the one hand, who ranged all over the world in his settings and his Gothic tales, whether of the Middle Ages, like The Masque of the Red Death, or The Fall of the House of Usher, or of his own time, like The Black Cat and The Telltale Heart. So Poe is one type of the American Gothic. Nathaniel Hawthorne was the other type, drawing particularly on the Puritans in The House of the Seven Gables and The Scarlet Letter, and many of his short tales. And these traditions of the American Gothic continued into the 20th century with H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King, and all of their followers, their imitators, and perhaps the greatest writer of the Gothic in America, Shirley Jackson. And all of this is in my book, which will be coming out hopefully by the end of the year. I have a previous book about it, and that's why I was asked to speak in Prague. And another writer, there's a whole Black tradition of the Gothic and supernatural and horror, and I was asked to speak about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is not usually read that way, but the folks in Prague wanted to hear about it, and so I did. And Sherry says Chelm, no, it's Chelm, and Chelm, it's in probably, it was in the Pale of Settlement, modern day Poland, actually. So that was the fastest explanation of the Gothic on record, I think. Anybody else?
Yes.
I
yes.
have a question, Faye, if I could.
Sure.
Will your book be an academic book, or is it a book that all of us could read?
I like to think both. My first book was a purely academic book, which is why you don't find it in bookstores. This one is meant to be a textbook for upper level undergraduates or graduate students, but it's also meant to be accessible to a wider audience. So there's a whole lot of footnotes, there's a lot of bibliography, but I hope that I've written it in as accessible a style as I used today. It's from a publisher called Anthem, which is an international publisher, UK, Australia, and the US, but it still you won't find it in bookstores. It'll be available as an ebook, it'll be available online, it'll be available by order, but mostly they hope that colleges will adopt it as a textbook. So. Okay, Jerome, you had another question?
Yeah, actually a comment. If one visits some local, very old cemeteries, the early burials, the early stones, typically before 1840, represented a horror, an evil, a death as very hellish, indicative of the Gothic milieu, whereas as that wore away, as the influence of the early Puritans wore away, if one looks at the inscriptions on headstones after that, death became more of a benign type heavenly future. Mm-hmm. So it's, again, a very interesting demarcation of concept from the evil to the benign as evidenced in the older cemeteries.
Yes. That is so true. Although the death's head or skull or the winged skull that you see on a lot of the earliest headstones was not only meant to be not so much evil, it was meant to be what's called a memento mori. That is, remember, you are going to die. As I am, so will you be. So repent now before it's too late. There's a wonderful poem inscribed on a tomb in the old colonial burying ground in Norwich from the Reverend Lord, who was the minister of the First Congregational Church for like 50 years or more. And basically he says, "You didn't listen to me while I was alive, so read this poem now and listen." So yes, I do spend a lot of time looking at old gravestones. Well, it's if you want a break before Minion, I should probably sign off now, Kathleen.
Faye, that was absolutely wonderful. I'm sure it was evocative of, grandparents and great-grandparents. And I know for me, it was very evocative of my mother-in-law. So thank you very much. It was wonderful.
But Phyllis was never a superstitious person. She